One thing is certain. If David Geffen wanted to make sure Leaving Neverland was a cultural weapon used against Michael Jackson's legacy, he had all the most powerful, effective tools and weapons to make it happen, including Oprah. And he used them. All right, we've exposed the logical motivations of Wade Robson, James Safechuck, Oprah's role in co-signing it, and the shadowy influence of David Geffen behind the scenes promoting Leaving Neverland to become the widely seen hit that it became. But now, let's talk about the guy who actually made the documentary. The man behind the camera, the single person most directly responsible for piecing together this one-sided narrative and presenting it to the world as fact. Dan Reed. This dude's a real piece of work, taking promo pictures for a documentary about child molestation that looks like a fucking 90s boy band reunion. So let me ask you a question. If you were directing a documentary about one of the most famous people in history, a person who'd been investigated by the FBI for over a decade with no evidence of wrongdoing, you'd think you at least try to show both sides, right? Maybe interview people who knew Michael Jackson personally. Maybe dig up and consider the mountain of contradictory evidence that called the accuser's stories into question. Maybe even, do some actual investigative journalism. Okay, fuck it. How about just a little basic due diligence? Nope, not Dan Reed. Because if Leaving Neverland proves anything, it's that Dan Reed isn't a truth teller, he's a storyteller. One who is either too lazy, too gullible, or too invested in his own agenda to actually do his job. So who exactly is Dan Reed, and why did he, a guy with no previous connection to Michael Jackson or any of the other parties involved, end up directing Leaving Neverland? You ever heard the term patsy? Stay with me. Before Leaving Neverland, Dan Reed was primarily known for making war documentaries and investigative films about terrorism and organized crime. Some of his most notable works include Terror in Mumbai in 2009, a documentary about the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks, The Pedophile Hunter in 2014, a film about a vigilante hunting online predators, and 3 Days of Terror, the Charlie Hebdo attacks in 2016, a documentary on the terrorist attacks in Paris. Now, notice something. All of these are based on real, verifiable events. They involve actual terrorists, crimes, and documented evidence, and making a documentary about them involves serious investigation. Yet when it came to Leaving Neverland, Reed abandoned all investigative principles. No cross-examination, no research into Wade and James' past inconsistencies, no mention of the fact that Wade Robson had tried and failed to get hundreds of millions of dollars from the Michael Jackson estate in court, no effort to talk to Michael Jackson's family, close friends, or former employees who could refute or even verify the claims. Instead, he just took two men's words as gospel, edited their stories into a 4-hour emotional manipulation marathon, and expected the world to buy it without questioning. That's not journalism. That's not documentary filmmaking. That's straight up propaganda. So why did Dan Reed do such a 180 and agree to make a hack job like Leaving Neverland? If he wasn't some lifelong anti-Jackson crusader, what was his real motivation for making this documentary? Well, let's start with the obvious answer: money and a shot at a huge increase in status. Dan was trying to glow up. See, as of 2018, Reed was a respected but relatively niche filmmaker. His work was known in the UK and among documentary buffs, but he wasn't exactly a household name. Then HBO and Channel 4, the UK network that co-produced Leaving Neverland, came knocking with a very interesting offer. Make a documentary about Michael Jackson being a child abuser. Focus only on the accusers. And oh yeah, don't worry about fact-checking because, Me Too vibes. And what about MJ's kids and family and fans, or hell, people who just want an intelligent, objective, fair examination of the subject?
Because f*** them, that's why.
And guess what? Reed took the deal. This wasn't his passion project. This wasn't a crusade for truth. This was a made-for-TV sensationalist hit job designed to stir controversy, go viral, and make a lot of people very f***ing rich. Dan Reed wasn't some truth-seeking journalist on a mission. he was a hired gun. But here's where it gets even more absurd. If you're making a film that relies entirely on the credibility of two people and their stories, wouldn't you at least do a background check? Wouldn't you want to make sure that your accusers weren't trying to cash in on false claims, that they hadn't previously defended Michael Jackson under oath? I mean, you and I would, but not if you're Dan Reed. Because according to his own public statements, he didn't even consider it necessary to interview anyone outside of Wade Robson, James Safechuck, and their families. That's right, he never interviewed Michael Jackson's family, who had firsthand knowledge of the accuser's past relationships with MJ, former employees of Neverland who had seen Wade and James interact with MJ over the years, the FBI agents who investigated Jackson for over a decade and found nothing, other boys who spent time with Michael, like Macaulay Culkin or Brett Barnes, who have repeatedly said Jackson never did anything inappropriate. He didn't even try to be objective. And when people started questioning the documentary after it was released, Reed responded by doubling down instead of addressing any of the inconsistencies. When asked why he didn't interview anyone who could provide an alternate perspective, Reed literally said, quote, "What's the point in interviewing people who would say you didn't do it?" Unquote. Yes, that's an actual quote from the director of Leaving Neverland. Sit with that shit for a minute. But this one's even crazier. Remember the impossible train station story James Safechuck told about being abused in Michael Jackson's train station 2 years before it even existed? Well, when confronted with this blatant untruth, Dan Reed didn't even refute it. He didn't even try to justify it. Instead, he casually admitted on Twitter, "Yeah, there seems to be no doubt about the station date. The date they have wrong is the end of the abuse." What? You can't make this shit up. This is like Tyler Perry's Medea Makes a Documentary. I mean, that's not just biased filmmaking. That's straight up fraud. Full stop. Now, of course, as I said before, after Leaving Neverland came out, the proverbial shit hit the fan. The backlash was immediate, vicious, and massive. Michael Jackson's fans, independent journalists, and even some mainstream media outlets started picking apart the holes in the documentary. So how did Dan Reed respond? By making fucking sequels. Leaving Neverland 2, that he just released in 2025, a desperate attempt to keep the story alive, and Leaving Neverland 3, he's announced he's releasing in the future. This motherfucker's trying to make a trilogy like he's in the MCU. Now, he tried a lot of verbal, moral, and logic gymnastics, aka bullshit, to justify and rationalize the one-sided hack job he did in Leaving Neverland, and now to try to justify him releasing a part 2 and soon part 3. But at this point, it's painfully obvious. Dan Reed isn't interested in the truth. He's interested in his damn career, period. He's seen what happens when you build your name off controversy. HBO, Channel 4, and a lot of mainstream media will protect you as long as they can make cheese off of it, even when your work gets dismantled by facts. And based on the fact that he just threw out a sloppy, pointless, 15-minute, boring mess of a documentary and called it Leaving Neverland 2, it doesn't look like he plans to stop anytime soon, if ever. So don't be surprised if 10 years from now, you see a trailer for Dan Reed's Leaving Neverland Part 8, surviving Michael Jackson's grandchild's dog walker's journey to Pet World's valet parking. Look, it looks pretty clear that as long as he thinks there's money to be made in demonizing Michael Jackson after he's dead and can't respond or defend himself, Dan Reed will keep the machine running as long as he can. All that said, in the grand scheme of things, Dan Reed was just a pawn in a much bigger game. He was the perfect, useful idiot, willing to slap his name on a fraudulent documentary in exchange for money, prestige, and hopefully a seat at Hollywood's elite table. And what he probably never thought about when he signed on to do it, he was the perfect fall guy to blame everything on if anything went wrong or the movie ever came under fire for its sloppy one-sidedness and lack of integrity. The fingers all got pointed at the low man on the totem pole, the director, the patsy. You got bamboozled, Dan. And now, the final conspirator. The final major player was HBO. the network that proudly co-produced and aired Leaving Neverland. In promoting its release, HBO positioned itself as a champion of truth and justice, bravely exposing the dark secrets of an alleged predator and giving survivors of abuse a voice to speak their truth. But here's what they didn't tell you. HBO was getting absolutely demolished in the streaming wars at the time and desperately needed a big, buzzworthy hit or somebody ass was getting fired. In other words, this whole thing didn't have a damn thing to do with being a champion for victims of abuse. This was about money, power, and staying relevant in a streaming landscape where they were getting their asses kicked by Netflix and others. Let's go back further in time and look at the evidence. Back in 1992, HBO signed a contract with Michael Jackson to broadcast his Dangerous World Tour special. That contract had one very important clause. HBO agreed never to disparage Michael Jackson in the future. And this wasn't just some casual handshake deal. It was a binding legal agreement that HBO willfully ignored when they decided to make and air Leaving Neverland. Which begs the question, why would HBO knowingly violate a contract with one of the most famous entertainers of all time? Was it because they had new undeniable evidence against Jackson? Was it because they felt they were morally obligated to expose the truth? Well, let's jump back forward in time a little for the answer, because again, by the time Leaving Neverland aired in March 2019, HBO was struggling to keep up in the rapidly changing media landscape. Streaming was taking over, and HBO, once the undisputed king of premium cable, was falling behind. To paraphrase Kamala Harris, Netflix was eating them for lunch. HBO had been slow to embrace streaming, while Netflix had already built a global empire with over 139 million subscribers by early 2019, more than double HBO's numbers. HBO's biggest show, Game of Thrones, was about to end, and with its final season coming in April 2019, its leadership was terrified about what would happen after their cash cow was gone. AT&T had just bought HBO's parent company, Warner Media, and the new AT&T leadership was breathing down HBO's neck, demanding that they produce content that was more buzzworthy and attention-grabbing, just like Netflix. So what did HBO do? They needed a high-profile, controversial, headline-dominating event, something that would create massive public discussion, outrage, and drive up viewership. Enter Leaving Neverland. Of course, as you know by now, HBO had deep financial ties to Oprah Winfrey's own network and to David Geffen, one of the most powerful men in entertainment. And lo and behold, all three parties seemed to clearly be working in different ways and avenues to promote, legitimize, and push Leaving Neverland to public acceptance and mega hit status. What's the chance that was all coincidence? I'd say about the same chance that Diddy's 1,000 bottles of baby oil were the result of an ordering mix-up from Amazon. He probably meant to hit 10 on the quantity screen, right? And that helps answer another question you might have. Why didn't HBO vet Leaving Neverland? Why didn't they fact-check any of its claims? Why didn't they interview anyone from Jackson's family, estate, or legal team? Why didn't they look into the mountain of red flags or contradictions in Robson and Safechuck's stories and address them in advance in the press so it didn't destroy the credibility of their film? Why didn't they acknowledge that both men had previously testified under oath that Jackson never harmed them? Because let's be real, if you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation under pressure from a new parent company making a 4-hour documentary about serious criminal allegations being leveled against a legendary entertainer with millions of rabid, protective fans, wouldn't you want to cover all sides? Of course you would. But HBO didn't care. They only cared about creating an explosive, headline-grabbing documentary that would generate controversy, outrage, attention, and most importantly, new subscribers for their struggling streaming service. And I gotta be honest, it worked flawlessly for a little while. Then the backlash began. After Leaving Neverland aired, the response from Michael Jackson's fans and independent journalists was immediate and overwhelming. I think the technical term is shitstorm. Inconsistencies in the accuser's stories were exposed. Dan Reed and the accusers were embarrassed on live TV, and HBO itself was sued for $100 million by the Michael Jackson estate for violating their contract with Jackson. It was a bad look. And today, Leaving Neverland is widely seen as an unserious hit piece and an embarrassment, and HBO's involvement seriously damaged their credibility. But at the end of the day, HBO didn't give a damn about the truth, or about how airing the unproven allegations in their documentary to hundreds of millions of people around the world would affect Michael Jackson's legacy, or his fans, or his children. At the time, they were desperate and only cared about ratings, headlines, revenue, and staying relevant in the streaming wars. And releasing Leaving Neverland gave them all four. Look, I told you the story was wild. There were a lot of moving parts, a lot of players, a lot of agendas, and a lot going on beneath the surface and behind the scenes in this whole crazy gambit. So, before I pull it all together for you like I promised, let me lay out all the pieces of the puzzle for you one last time. Look, don't be fooled. By now, surely you can see the truth. This was never about justice. This was never about protecting or believing victims. This wasn't about exposing the truth. At this point, it's got to be painfully obvious to you what the real story behind Leaving Neverland was about. It's got to be painfully obvious what they're hiding. HBO, Wade Robson, James Safechuck, Dan Reed, Oprah Winfrey, and David Geffen all played a role in pulling off one of the biggest media cons of all time. Not for truth, not for justice, but for money, power, and in Geffen's case, just plain, super petty, Donald Trump style revenge. This wasn't an expose or a crusade for justice, it was a business plan. This was a coordinated cash grab, a money heist disguised as a hit job, a carefully orchestrated multi-million-dollar scheme designed to use Michael Jackson's murder as a cash cow and a vehicle to carry out a personal vendetta, with several of Hollywood's top players pulling the strings in front of and behind the curtains. And now, the most foul, most despicable part of their scheme that they ran on Michael Jackson's memory and the public. This isn't just my opinion. This is what all the evidence points to. They didn't vet or fact-check Wade Robson or James Safechuck's stories on purpose. They didn't question them. They didn't push back on their inconsistencies or red flags or logical impossibilities. They didn't interview anyone who might be able to corroborate or dispute their stories and allegations on purpose. Because they knew if they did, the accuser's stories would fall apart, and then they wouldn't be able to release their bombshell expose documentary that was sure to be a sensation and a mega hit. And no mega hit, that means no critical acclaim, no new subscribers, and no Emmys for HBO. No multi-million-dollar payday for Robson and Safechuck. No billion-dollar brand-building moments for Oprah. No fame and fortune for Dan Reed. And no revenge for David Geffen. So instead, they released their fraudulent quote-unquote documentary, fully aware of its problems and untruths, and just figured they could overcome and crush any pushback from the public through the brute force power of their Hollywood celebrity media influence machine. And because after its initial success, Leaving Neverland was largely discredited and disgraced in the public eye, that's why I'm so confident in the prediction I made to you at the very beginning of this video, that Leaving Neverland Part 2, Surviving Michael Jackson, will be a largely ignored, utter flop that almost no one will see. Because the massive celebrity media influence machine will not be behind it, pushing it. They already got their money, awards, acclaim, and revenge that they wanted on the first one and moved on. And they left Dan Reed swinging in the wind. He's now on his own. And Michael Jackson, the man who was investigated by the FBI for over a decade and was never found guilty of anything, the man who had been acquitted in a court of law, the man who wasn't even alive to defend himself, he, his memory, and his legacy was used, exploited, and smeared for profit and power. This was their plan. That was the scheme and the dark trick on the public that they hid and are still hiding. So, ultimately, what was the outcome? 6 years after the release of Leaving Neverland, where are they now? Well, Wade Robson's lawsuits have been thrown out of court twice, but he's no quitter. He's still trying to sue and waiting for a trial date on his revived lawsuit, now set for November 2026. James Safechuck has effectively vanished again, but is also waiting to, quote-unquote, fight for little Jimmy in the 2026 trial, where he hopes to get millions of dollars, presumably to send back in time to little Jimmy. In response to the questioning of her After Neverland special, or the many questions about why she didn't question any of the possible ulterior motives, changing stories, conflicting statements, and impossible claims of the two accusers, Oprah Winfrey has said exactly nothing. She's been completely silent, no retraction, no apology, no acknowledgement that she made a mistake, nothing. After setting the entire scheme to promote and validate Leaving Neverland in motion on his yacht way back in 2019 on Oprah's birthday, David Geffen has quietly continued doing what he does and living his life as one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, and still maintaining the undisputed title of the world's worst birthday gift giver. Curiously, after initially insisting that they would always stand by their film, HBO has quietly removed all traces of Leaving Neverland from their Max streaming service. You can't find it anywhere to see it. And finally, director Dan Reed is making 2 more parts of Leaving Neverland, including the just released blockbuster available on YouTube, Leaving Neverland 2, Surviving Michael Jackson, a new 50-minute sequel to Leaving Neverland about, and let me check my notes here, following accusers Wade Robson and James Safechuck as they attempt to get a trial after suing Jackson's companies, which are controlled by his estate. There are unsubstantiated rumors that Leaving Neverland 2 is what really plays on repeat when you click on one of those black screen, guaranteed go to deep sleep in 2 minutes videos on YouTube. Now let me be clear, child molestation and sexual abuse are serious and reprehensible crimes, and I want anybody who's guilty of them to be caught, prosecuted, convicted, and their asses thrown under the jail, period. But at the end of the day, Leaving Neverland wasn't a documentary presenting compelling evidence that any of that occurred. It was an assassination, a cash grab, a hit piece, a flimsy construction of stories and accusations that started falling apart the moment people started asking questions. Hell, it was basically just tea. But guess what? As my father used to always say, the truth eventually always comes out. And despite the emotional manipulation of the stories and allegations, the promotion by beloved celebrities and public figures, the push by powerful Hollywood players, the primetime Emmys, and the desperate attempts to craft a monstrous narrative with no evidence and get people to believe it, Michael Jackson's legacy still stands. His music still inspires. His name still shines. And apparently, no amount of Hollywood scheming can change the fact that the king of pop still reigns. Flawed, imperfect, human, and proven not guilty in a court of law.